Hello, this is Zara Richter. I am recording with the Facing Autonomy podcast. Today we have an excellent show for you today. I'm going to be hosting a conversation with a blogger and a thinker, Conrad Bongard Hamilton, and this conversation will be co-hosted by my brilliant and anarchist scholar friend Violet Chrysanthemum. And our conversation today is on the limitations and potentials of Marxist and anarchist feminism. And we're going to be starting with we're going to be talking to Conrad about his recent blog on this topic, which Conrad, you can tell us the title of that in just a moment. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Violet and Conrad, in any order.
Sure. I'm Conrad Hamilton. I'm currently finishing a doctorate at Paris 8 University in France under the supervision of Catherine Malibu and Pierre Castelnugas, and that deals with the relationship between social agency, categories of race, gender, man versus nature, and so on, in relation to the value form or the economic structure of Marx's work. And I'm also a co-author, along with Ben Burgess, Marion Trejo, and Matthew McManus, of a book for Zero Books titled Myth and Mayhem, a Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson. And I think today we'll be talking a little bit about an article I wrote for and Journal for Theoretical Philosophy, which is a proxy of the New Center, titled Sex in the Age of Capital.
Right. So I'm Violet. I describe myself as an anarchist and an independent scholar from India. I'm a trans woman as well. Well, when I say anarchist, I actually mean actually describe myself as an anarchist to the communists and a communist to the anarchists kind of thing. But anyway, I'm really interested in looking into the limitations of what is considered the liberal trans discourse that is quite popular these days, as well as kind of refuting transphobic rhetoric that comes from a lot of transphobic feminists without falling back on a kind of liberal trans discourse. So kind of like charting a different path from charting a path that does not fall into either of those two, in that dichotomy between like the liberal trans discourse and transphobic discourse. So yeah, so I'm very interested in what Conrad has to say. I really enjoyed reading the text, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and I'm going to introduce myself again in a new capacity. I've been running this podcast for a little bit less than a year at this point. My name is Zara Richter. I am a trans woman. And I have already blogged and written a little bit. I'm also a PhD student about transfeminism. I have been involved in discussions of disability and Marxism heavily in my scholarly work. In the past 5 to 6 years. But I myself identify closer, of course, anarchist and communist, but and communist and anarchist, but also influenced by CLR James and the autonomia movement from Italy, all of which have a bearing on the last 10 or so episodes that this podcast has been doing. So to start the conversation, Conrad, your piece, Sex in the Age of Capital, you identify this difference between kind of like productivist Marxist feminists and Marxist feminists that are more in a post-structural approach. This anti-naturalist materialism that is calling itself xenofeminism.
Mhm.
Is that right? And you see this difference between xenofeminism and the work of, say, Donna Haraway? Can you explain that to us, Conrad?
Well, I don't mean to suggest that. I mean, I think xenofeminism is very, very influenced by Haraway, and I know, like Patricia Reed, for example, has attempted to make use of Haraway's notion of situated knowledge as a way of, um, trying to conceptualize the epistemic biases that pervade the knowledge that we acquire, right? No, in that piece, the primary binary that I set out is, if I remember properly, is between the tendency of xenofeminists to think of you know woman is a term that's subject to constant transformations, right? In sort of an accelerationist vector of change, and the contrast between that and I think the quite, anti-futurist position of someone like Nina Power, who believes that the world is sort of constitutively divided between a male and female parallax, right? And that this has, a relationship to a sort of binary biological dispensation.
Right, right. And so I think that there's hints here that Nina Power and this more binarized form of feminism is really drawing upon the second wave of feminism, a more
Mm-hmm.
sex negative kind of biological centric approach to feminism that also had ties to things like ecofeminism and,
Mm-hmm.
and came out of the 1970s wave of writing about things like rape culture. Is that correct? Do you think Nina Power is allied to that?
I mean, it's interesting to talk about Nina Power and second wave feminism because I think there exists a lot of ambiguity within second wave feminist texts. So, for example, like if you look at something like the second sex, Nina Power spoke in the conference I was at. She talked about how Simone de Beauvoir expresses this great interest in biology and discusses it at length, often I think in sort of a psychoanalytical vein. And that's true, but also the second sex is still a text that has a great influence upon people who aren't so disposed to the sort of biological viewpoint. I certainly don't think it's the case, and maybe you'd be more acquainted with this issue than I am. But I given its sort of cultural importance, and the fact that I certainly don't think it's the case that all people who align with the second wave are transphobic. Again, I think there's quite a bit of ambiguity within that sort of tradition, right? So yes, she allies herself in a way with second wave feminism, but she does so in a way I think which is often fairly selective in terms of deliberately taking aspects of the oeuvre of second wave feminism, which are the most sort of biologically reductive examples she can find, and then applying them, in order to support her argument, right?
Violet, how do you see this difference between the xenofeminists and the kind of proto second wave feminists that we're getting from Conrad? Violet?
Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So I think it's a very interesting distinction, and Conrad already described it as a binary. So it's very interesting to me that in both cases, whether it is of the xenofeminists or or Nina Power, they kind of take a position against or for nature, where like nature becomes kind of the crux of what they're defining themselves against or for. But what I find interesting is like this idea of nature that they're kind of defining themselves through. Is it already not a disciplinary construct of sorts? Like I think Baden's text talks about this, like when they invoke Susan Stryker's words. So just a second, I'll just bring up the particular quote over here. Right. So they talk about fighting against, say, uh, the whole kind of the whole identity thing, but without falling back on something called the natural. And basically, just a second. So, uh, yeah. So they say that here they're quoting Stryker. So Stryker says, "As though we forego the privilege of naturalness, we are not deterred, for we ally ourselves instead with the chaos and blackness from which nature itself spills forth." So yeah. So in this sense, like the nature that they're defining themselves against, is it not already nature that is basically kind of already based on a split kind of thing, like the nature culture split, or nature seen as like this source for extracting things for production, or like the whole like the whole binary itself is premised on a conception of nature that I find kind of kind of dubious. And what is interesting, another interesting point for me, is that Nina Power seems to fall back on the notion of sensuousness and the body. But what is interesting for me is like, if we are to go back to the materialism of the body, then do we necessarily need to actually uphold this notion of biological sex? Or to put it otherwise, the removal of focus from the body is not, in my opinion, necessitated if we were to refute the notion of biological sex, because biological sex, in a sense, could already be understood as a technique of capturing the material body. That is to say, rendering the body more docile, more malleable, for the purposes of government and for the purposes of incorporating the body into production, to make it basically a tool for production. And so it seems to me like Nina Power is kind of arguing against discursive resignification, as Conrad calls it, as a tactic. But to argue against discursive resignification, she simply falls back on like the discursive signification of biological sex. So it seems to me like her problem is like the discursive regimes of like this kind of these discursive regimes of, like, say, gender, etc., have proliferated to a much larger extent, but she simply wants to go back to how it used to be, which is a discursive regime based on the binary. So so it seems to me like what I would say is like uh, um Nina Power's position, to me, it seems like it's like, on one hand, I agree in like that the kind of like what has happened with a lot of liberal uh, um, liberal LGBT discourse is kind of like the profusion of these discursive techniques to produce even more kind of docile bodies in different ways. But it seems to me like she's not actually contesting these like regimes of sexuation and the production of like this kind of docile subjects, but merely lamenting the fact that it's like the content has changed, whereas like she simply wants the form, but with like the older content that's kind of gone out of fashion. So yeah, I'd be interested in what Conrad has to say about that.
Yeah, very good points, Violet. Thanks. The first thing I'd say just about xenofeminism, and to be clear, I love the xenofeminists. I love Patricia Reed and Katrina Birch, and these kind of people. But I mean, I think it's interesting to talk about the way that nature is conceptualized in their work, because I think what really interests me about them, and maybe I can't do justice to it here, But what really interests me about xenofeminism is the way that I feel like you have somewhat, somewhat conflicting notions which emerge. So I think on one side in xenofeminism, you see that there's a real influence of Marxist productivism, right? Again, this sort of, thinking of nature as a negativity, which can be, changed and altered as we like. And that's interesting because actually the productivist reading of Marx is itself a little bit, while, maybe widely known, is itself a little bit dated. I mean, if you go back to like Adorno and Alfred Schmidt, that's sort of what they think about Marx. But if you look now, like Kohei Saito had a book that won the Deutscher Prize, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. I think what you're seeing is that there was a sort of shift where Marx's first strategy toward critiquing Malthus is to say, well, Liebig's soil science proves that we can manipulate nature infinitely and create whatever kind of natural productivity we like. But then later, as a response to actually revisions and Liebig's observations and the limitations of soil science, Marx starts to accept, well, actually, there may be a limit here that we're talking about, right? And we could get into discussing, how this sort of relates to thermodynamics as well.
Yeah,
But
there's the whole concept of the metabolic rift as well. So, I mean, in in the Saito book that you. Hello.
yeah, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Yes.
was just
Okay.
saying that the Marx eco-socialism thing. There's the whole concept of the metabolic rift as well with regards to nature. So
Yeah, which I'm a bit skeptical of actually, because I think that, like Jason Moore has criticized the metabolic rift, and he said, like, we have to talk about how the notion of nature is constituted as a consequence of material structures. I think the problem with the metabolic rift is it slides too easily into a sort of man-nature kind of way of seeing the world. But that aside, so on one side you have this kind of old school Marxist productivist aspect in xenofeminism, but on the other side you have this very, very Hegelian and really like analytic Hegelian, like Pittsburgh Hegelian, Brandomian sort of inferentialism, right? So you see the influence of people like Reza Negarestani, Ray Brazier, and so on. And that's really interesting because, like, that, when they use these words like alienation, like it's certainly not being used in a sort of rigorous Marxist sense, right? So like Diane Bauer, I think we talked about like biological alienation. So in a way, you have on one hand this view of nature as a kind of nullity that I think, has been propagated predominantly, through Marxism, whether that's an appropriate way to describe Marx's views or not. And on the other hand, you have this Hegelian view that I think sort of presupposes the individual reasoner, right, as the kind of instrument, or the ontically constitutive unit of philosophy, right? But I think the best sort of the best kind of critique of that, maybe there's a book called, there's a essay called, I forget the name of it now, but it's by Ben Woodard, user input errors or something, user errors, I think maybe. But basically, what Woodard questions some of the approach of Brandom, in which you have reasoners meeting and giving and asking reasons, and Woodard suggests that Brandom doesn't go far enough in problematizing the discourse of reason itself, right, and the way that it's wielded unequally. So I think in a way, if you look at this kind of Brandomian vision of the way reason functions. I mean, I point this out in my current essay. It reminds me a lot of Marx's comments on primitive commodity exchange. It's like, okay, in an ideal world, everyone just meets and trades their commodities. But in actuality, that's not how it works, right? You have the ownership of means of production by some people. I mean, your odds of going to Harvard in the United States, I think, if you go to Harvard, it's likely you come from the 1% richest of American families, right? So I don't think, the resource to reason is equally distributed. So that would be, that'd be kind of my problem with xenofeminism. But I do, I have great respect for their project. As regards power, you made another comment. What did you say? You said, "Oh yeah, about power." Yeah, I agree with what you're saying about power, and that's why I actually refer to the thesis as being tautological in my piece, because the problem with it is that it only works if you accept the starting axiom that sex is just biological. And then, from that basis, there are these gendered parallaxes and everything emanates out of that. And this goes back to another problem, which is like, she talks about second wave feminism, but I really think like the structure of her work is mostly from Feuerbach, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
And
Right.
she's sort of a Marxist humanist, apostate Marxist humanist now, I guess. But yeah, it's funny actually. There's a quote. I always get it. It's like, do I have this here? I want to get this quote. It's from Louis Althusser. I don't know if you've ever read his essay, Sur Feuerbach, or on Feuerbach. But he has a great. I just got to pull this up. He has a great. Yeah, he says the idea. He's talking about Feuerbach and this idea of, because Feuerbach has this sort of logic of complementarity, right? He says, man, woman is sort of the existence of the essence of man, and so forth. And Althusser says this idea is based on the theoretical premise that the essence of the human species and human society is wholly contained in the essence, existence, identity of the man-woman relation. This is plainly not a Marxist, but a petty bourgeois humanist anarchist thesis, and it wreaks theoretical, aesthetic, ideological, and political havoc. So, of course, I'm not intending to criticize anyone in the chat, but I do think it's interesting, right? Because I haven't got into this enough, but you could probably trace a line through the way that Althusser criticizes Feuerbach and these sort of binary structures, and moreover, just the presupposition of a sort of biological structure to which all our experiences necessarily index and emanate from. Right. You could probably trace a line through that to like his theory of interpolation, and then to its deployment by Judith Butler, right? So I think this is funny, right? Althusser, we know, killed his wife, right? But we can say now, yes, Althusser is a true pro-trans theorist, right?
Yeah. Zara?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting discussion because I think we're beginning to see trans thinkers are questioning Butler and questioning the kind of the Lacan, Althusser, Butler kind of legacy that you're getting in post-structuralist feminism. Even in queer theory, you get arguments which they swing from criticizing naturality on face, which I think makes sense, but they go all the way to this point of seemingly replacing the signifier for the natural, for the natural, or seemingly putting so much emphasis on signification or citationality in a Derridean kind of vocabulary, and we were going to have another guest on this podcast who is not here, who is writing more about a more labor perspective on gender. And I think you get a more labor perspective on gender from people like Nancy Fraser, or from the books on social reproduction theory, which are inspired somewhat by. We've had Silvia Federici as a guest on this podcast once before, by the autonomous feminists like Federici, Di Fortunati, and some others who are really thinking about sex, gender, whatever they are, as very much constituted as much by labor as by biological or discursive categories.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And actually that's kind of, I mean, I think lumping in Althusser with Butler or Lacan is a little bit tricky, because he does have a notion of materiality, right? Sort of economic determination in the last instance. But I mean, I guess I see where I'm coming from is I think I see the kind of anti-humanist tradition as, because I think that this is sort of an issue, like there is a distance from questions of materiality in the work of Louis Althusser that I do think leads his work to predominantly sort of be parlayed into kind of post-structuralism. And I think that the anti-humanist tradition has been continued in a sense through sort of new kind of value theoretical readings of Marx, right? Which are much more focused on a kind of diachronic historical analysis than a sort of synchronic analysis of the mode of production or the conjuncture that Althusser favored. So I guess what I've been trying to do is to say if we talk about the conference in Skopje that I went to, Xenofeminism and other forms of materialist feminism, I think, or materialist or realist feminism or something. The real question of the conference was, what does materialism mean? right? Because materialism is very different. If you're talking about sort of, the materialism that Marx expresses in the German ideology, modes of production, relations of production, social formations, and so on, then if you're talking about, the sort of transcendental biologism, right, of power, which might align in certain respects with the early Marx, but nonetheless, that's a big difference, right? So what I'm trying to do is to use the sort of value theoretical analysis to develop an understanding that is not biological, but has to have some kind of biological reference, I think, of how categories of gender and sexuality emerge, right?
Right. Um, I have to say that um, Zara's talking about like these post-structuralist readings, but like it seems to me like the work of Butler or like the kind of a lot of the material that actually passes for queer theory does not have much in common with the work of Foucault, for instance. And I think Chris Chitty has like a brilliant article on this called Reassessing Foucault, Modern Sexuality and the Transition to Capitalism, like where Butler's reading of, for instance, uh, her, in Gender Trouble, like her entire reading of Foucault, for instance, completely omits the idea of biopower. And the reading of even Hercule Barbin, who was quote hermaphrodite unquote, who was a hermaphrodite, are very different with and reaching very different conclusions. And I think in Foucault you already get in History of Sexuality Volume 1, for instance, and especially if you read it in conjunction with Marx, you already get a notion of sex where labor has a pretty important role to play, which is to say that the basic thesis of History of Sexuality Volume 1 is that, and I'm quoting Christie's article here, that sexuality could only become a problem for societies in which communities of producers have been separated from their means of production. So, biopower, for instance, to put biopower in Marxist vocabulary, the equivalent would be what Marx calls the real subsumption of labor. So the why sex emerges as what Foucault describes as this like intersectional point of like disciplinary technologies and biopolitical technologies is precisely due to the fact that it's emerging with capitalism, where like through this idea of sex there is a territorialization of the body itself and its insertion into like the production process and into like units like the family, which have to then go on to take part in the processes of social reproduction, etc., etc. So I think much of that is like missing in what passes for queer theory, and like in Butler's analysis, like all of that is like completely not there. So it like I think like Chitty has really described this well. Like with Butler, what happens is like there's a dematerialization of what Foucault called discourse, whereas like for Foucault the idea was to always situate discourse in relation to its outside, like not within the text itself but within its strategic context. With Butler, discourse becomes like this free floating immaterial thing that just kind of that kind of just sets up like these discursive regimes that just come from nowhere, and like there's a dematerialization going on in a sense. So yeah, just wanted to I think what Conrad's article, like towards the end, what it talks about, like with Marxism and like the constitution of the male class, I think that's actually pretty compatible with this reading of biopower as like this like biopower emerging with like capitalism, when like people have been separated from their when producers have been separated from their means of production. So yeah, just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, well, Zara, should I can continue?
Go ahead and respond. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So my current kind of, it's actually interesting about this because like in the reading, I kind of quickly I present the works of like Gonzalez' Logic of Gender as being sort of aligned with like Engels' analysis, but there's a huge difference there because like Engels, you know, among other things, He situates the world historical defeat of women and the first class opposition as coinciding with the shift away from matrilineality, as well as the rise of monogamy. Monogamy, in the sense he characterizes it, which is monogamy for women, not for men. But obviously, with Gonzalez, she's very focused on the capitalist mode of production. So what I'm struggling with right now is, I think it's very easy if you just focus on the capitalist mode of production for someone like Power to say, well, you're kind of eliding the issue that, certain binary structures of gender presage that there are patriarchal forms which presage that. So what I'm currently kind of getting into is how, from a revised standpoint, you would try to look at. My approach is to try to look at the beginnings of a calcification of the binary social structure of gender as emerging as a consequence of commodity exchange and the elevation of agricultural productivity. And then to look at the biologization of sex as something that emerges with formal subsumption of labor. And then further to look at a countervailing tendency that emerges with the shift in which relative surplus value extraction becomes privileged. So, women go to work in the factories, productivity becomes, more a question of surplus value becomes a question of raising technological productivity to change the ratio of necessary and surplus labor that's performed each day, rather than just getting people to work more. So yeah, I'm trying to attempt a kind of periodization where you have gender as a consequence of sort of not as a uniform thing, like as a notional binary social structure that is very multivalent. Gender is emerging with sort of developed agriculture, sex with absolute surplus value, early capitalism, and then kind of feminism with relative surplus value. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, and I think that actually doesn't contradict the kind of Foucaultian history of capital that we get in say history of sexuality, or in Foucault's preface to Hercule Barbin, that the sex is being developed as this administrative discourse, around the time of the Enlightenment, which is modernizing formally religiously mediated distinctions, which were much more localized in a more feudal era within Europe, certainly, but also much more vastly localized within the indigenous society. And so we get this birth of, if we're using a trans vocabulary, which several of us might in this room, we get the origin of the cisgender binary, if you would say that such a thing existed, roughly around this time of this move from a feudal mode of production to an early mercantilist mode of production in that Engelsian kind of stagist theory of history, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and Engels, his 200th birthday just passed. There are some mistakes in Engels, but I think he was the one who, more than anyone else, helped cultivate the sort of position of Marxist feminism. One thing, I'm probably going to have to remove it from my essay, but one thing I was actually really interested in is a lot of stuff about patrilineality and patrilocality as being kind of the primitive condition of humans is beginning to be disproved. So actually, there's a book, Kinship, Behavior, and Primates, and in it there's an essay by a University of Utah anthropologist, Helen Alvarez, and I guess Carol Ember in the 70s, she had examined ethnographic samples from George Murdoch's 1967 ethnographic atlas, and she had concluded that 62% of hunter-gatherer societies were patrilocal. But basically, Alvarez sort of recoded the samples, and what she found was that there were no more patrilocal examples than there were matrilocal ones. But 25%
Right.
each. Most
Right.
were ambilocal. Now, one interesting thing about this, of course, lineality is not exactly the same as resonance, but one interesting thing about this is that more and more, I think what you can begin to see is that patrilocality or lineality begins to look like a response to post-Pleistocene conditions, in which you had tribes moving to northerly areas where women couldn't gather wild plants all year round, or existing within circumscribed areas. So I think it does certainly raise the possibility that if you go back to that tradition of like, Bachofen, Lewis Henry Morgan, Frederick Engels, that there may have actually been something right about this matrilineality thing, which is also funny because, in 1990 in Gender Trouble, Butler also dismisses this as just sort of the search for, a quote, authentic feminine. Now, some of the problems she raises about that are true, I think, regardless of the veracity of this. But it's interesting, again, that Butler is so sort of dismissal toward this notion as well.
Right, and just to come in once more, you see today, in the kind of afterlife of Butler's influence upon queer theory, that you get a lot of trans studies scholars getting their start, kind of very much rejecting this thesis of Butler, which is that there is no authentic feminine. And a lot of trans theorists would point out to you that Butler's gender trouble is based more around drag queens than it is around around a hermaphrodite like Herculine Barban in Foucault, or more around drag queens and cross dressers than people that Hirschfeld was assisting with their hormone replacement transition in the 1930s in Weimar Germany. So you get that in that Butler's reading of gender as performative is very much oriented in this post-structuralist thought of discursivity and the signifier, which perhaps Althusser isn't completely foldable into this, but certainly you can see some Derrida in that. Certainly you can see some of the late 20th century move away from move to critique Marxism on the part of many intellectuals, not excluding Foucault.
Yeah, you got me thinking. You did get me thinking about something, because I read the first chapter of the book that you gave me. Was it Jay Proser edited? And the first chapter deals a little bit with it deals with the idea, like, that there's this emphasis on like queer notions of like kind of like toying with these norms that are also connected with social class, and like Butler's notion of kind of the soul as being like the literalization of the body and this kind of thing. And I think the essay was sort of pointing out that part of the difficulty is that like a lot of trans people don't just experience their own identity in sort of a spirit of play or transgression that way, that it's a lot more unironic than that. Again, I just read it quickly, so I'm not maybe doing it justice. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I read also, like in the same day, I think I read an article by a Hungarian thinker, G.M. Tamás, and he was talking about how there's a difference between class and caste, right? And he talks about how, if you look at, I mean, Marx calls them class divisions, but he's making a different kind of distinction here. If you look at before the emergence of kind of the proletarian bourgeois divide, caste is something different than class, in the sense that when you're in a caste, you don't there's a certain flexibility that affords to the proletarian in terms of, as Lukács says, experiencing themselves as being commodified, right? There's a self-awareness of one's own commodification that is part of that. And in contradistinction to that, Tamás, he talks about caste as being, a group beholden to a kind of cosmological principle that emerges in a world in which, humanity and humankind are not considered coextensive, right? And so I think there's a great ambiguity, because women have been admitted to, they're in the labor force, but because they also continue to perform these more traditional roles of social reproduction. I think there's a great ambiguity that exists between, is the feminine, is it like a cosmological principle or a caste, or But then there's also the experiencing oneself in a commodified way as a worker that I think lends itself toward a more supple view of what that identity might represent, right? So I think that if you look at trans discourse, I think that in a way it's like to inhabit the, I might say something here that could be controversial, but to sort of to feel one's own identity, right? In a way that's consistent with social structures in our society, also means, to treat it, as I said, as a sort of cosmological principle, not just as something that can be, that's amorphous in that way. In the way that I think the experience of proletarianization is the experience of, seeing that all that is solid melts into air. As Marx says. So, but I do think it raises a serious question about internality and externality, as the author puts it, because I think that pretty much all feminism from Mary Wollstonecraft forward, and look, Butler is different than Irigaray or whatever, but I think, the dominant tendency is to, and maybe necessarily, to philosophize from the proletarian standpoint, right? From the amorphousness of, from this sort of, the amorphousness and the experience of reality as a transformative vector that's characteristic of proletarianization. And I mean, it's the first industrial revolution when we get vindication on the rights of women, like the start of feminism, right? Like, I don't, you have women going to the factories en masse. I don't think this is a coincidence, right, that happens. Does that make any sense at all?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I want to hear Violet's response to it, especially though.
Yeah, well, that bit about like all that is solid melts into air is, I think, like pretty accurate, because well, uh, because if we go by, like, say, how Deleuze and Guattari describe capitalism is precisely as like this capitalism entailing this massive deterritorialization, which is like or the codes, like if pre-capitalist social structures like were reliant on like strict codes, etc., then capitalism kind of undoes those codes, like those codes are decoded, and there is a massive reterritorialization of sorts. And you can see this like in the way that capitalist modernization um, kind of uh, uproots, say, some feudal structures or feudal relations, and but at the same time it also constantly reterritorializes. So like there's a constantly capitalism, because of like its very nature itself, constantly has like this peripheral deterritorializations, but then the system is like constantly trying to reterritorialize those like who are escaping kind of uh, the social, and so it tries to bring them back into the social. And I think you can even like understand a lot of modern trans discourse through this, at least like liberal trans discourse, in the sense that if like the capitalist regime of sexuation, it was something that territorialized bodies to turn them into like sources for production, for like say initially, suppose we say it was meant for like the factory production process, and etc., and everything, and all the social relations entailed by it. And if the experience of dysphoria to an extent is brought about by that territorialization of the body, by say the unboundedness of the body being broken by that kind of territorialization, then there is a kind of desubjectivation of the subject who has been created through that process, through the sexuation process. But at the same time, capital has to kind of bring those subjects back into the fold, and thus you get this like liberal trans discourse. And well, I would go ahead and include a lot of what passes for intersectionality into this as well, because the subject of intersectionality politics is the subject of bourgeois rights. So it kind of brings these subjects back into the fold, makes them producers again. Like with neoliberalism especially, we see this, like this kind of flattening, like difference is accommodated into the social order, but like difference is homogenized in the sense that all difference is fine as long as that difference can be integrated into the process of production. So it doesn't matter if you're, say, if you're trans, if you're, say, if like within the Indian context, if you're lower caste, if you're disabled, like to an extent everything can be integrated. Like neoliberal rationality, I'm not talking about how the actual implementation looks like, but at least the rationality itself makes space, makes room for like this kind of difference understood like as in through the lens of identity, as long as the difference can be incorporated into the process of production, as long as it can be imagined as a source for human labor. And so that is what is interesting for me. Like is there a way, like for instance, to envision um, uh, trans identity, for instance, that would not reterritorialize back onto the plane of, say, the state and capital? That would actually entail some kind of like uh, some kind of that would imply some ethical and political positions as well. And in a sense, like it would kind of profane identity as we know it, not simply just reinscribe itself into this whole like identitarian scheme for recognition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and,
I
and
mean, I
that's
guess.
a really tough
Right.
question. If I'm sorry, Conrad, if I may, and it really brings on this question, if trans identity could even work without forcing a reflection upon indigenous notions of sex and gender, which were not as which were much more localized, as mentioned previously. We're not a universal global scientific discourse. Indigenous notions of gender, and they necessitated certainly an earlier mode of economic development on a global sense. Can we have a trans discourse that is fully separated from ancient notions of sex and gender, which did not come under the administration of sex as a binarized set of categories? Before this show, in some chatter, I mentioned the historian of science, Alice Dreger, definitely worth reading for those who have not engaged with her work. She's working on the topic of intersexness and hermaphrodism. Whether or not that's part of transness is not something I can tell you definitively. People argue about whether intersex and hermaphrodism are trans or not, but I can tell you that kind of history, the kind of history, also more recent queer theorist Jules Gill Peterson also writes this way. That you get the administrative terms of sex are really an emergence from a combination of religious and scientific discourse. Hence Violet's continual references to Foucault, who was a very a skilled critic of both religious and scientific discourse of sex and gender and even governance, especially with his notion of biopower, which again falls out of these discussions very often. That is the connection of government to these discussions. But you also have to recognize that Foucault's work on biopower is being reclaimed by a bunch of kind of Harawaian productivist Marxists who will tell you that biopower can be good when it provides the technology to let people express themselves better. And what does it mean to inject estrogen as a trans woman if not to use industry to express yourself in a more complete manner? But then you get into these dicey questions about is medical transitioning modernity? I don't think you can say it's just that, but it's certainly not. It's certainly not the same kind of modernity that Foucault is critiquing. I would say it's a different face of the modern. And it's especially a different face of the modern if you consider that gender transitioning was starting to originate before the Nazi catastrophe in Weimar Germany. That's why I brought up Hirschfeld earlier. In my own, I wrote a dissertation chapter, which I haven't released to anyone really in the past summer, and I was thinking a lot about the ghosts of the lab. The Nazis burned Hirschfeld's lab, in Germany during the Weimar Republic, and there was all this work on the technologies of gender transitioning, and that was lost a little bit, and people don't recognize that early the Fordist modernism also produced gender transitions as much as it produced gas camps or death camps. So how can we look at this notion of modern technology and biopower if we're recognizing that these apparatuses, which we know are oppressive, also produce this strange byproduct of giving people these chemicals which allow them to express themselves in a way which is less bound to the current regime of capitalism that they're trapped in, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Should I wait or?
Go ahead, Conrad.
Yeah. It's interesting about this question. About I just want to cycle back and relate it to about the internality externality divide and the experience of reality based on a sort of transformative vector that I associated with proletarianization, and that I therefore think is there's a real difference, even in the sentiment of women in terms of how they perceive their own identities, right? Is it something which is sort of malleable that can be changed, or is it something which is more fixed, or do they consider their ambitions to be convergent with the male domain, more or less? But I think it's hard because again, if we're talking about internality and externality, and what I said was like, sort of the approach in which we see these categories as being, reality as being, imminently changeable versus the sort of unironic, embrace of identity that was discussed amongst certain trans women. There was the example of Venus in this documentary. I think that the what I would say about this, and this relates to this question, right, about like, is it right that people, is it the right thing that people physically transition, or is that not a sort of reterritorialization or something, right? I think the left often faces these issues, right? And again, I already said that I think there's, so we could say like, well, women are oppressed, right? But I think there's a lot of women who, insofar as they, still are, or insofar as they are still thinking more in terms of caste rather than class, that they're not likely to experience their own identity as one in which there is some kind of oppression, right? Because that already presupposes that there's like some problem, right? In the way that you live your life, in comparison or vis-a-vis another group, right? There's already a certain consciousness of social structure that's presupposed by that. Similarly, in France, there's a word they say, Islamo-gauchiste, right? Which is like a slur for people on the left who, in spite of their sort of left-wing principles, are supposedly hypocritical in their defense of the rights of Muslim populations, right? I don't see any other way of thinking what the left is apart from, and I'm not talking about like really, really strong productivist commitments necessarily, but apart from, this sort of proletarian thinking in which, reality is seen as being supple and subject to transformation. And so I don't, it's interesting in that essay, it was talking about the rift between, the director who made this film and the trans woman profiled within it, and the potential class antagonism and so forth. I mean, those are all serious issues. But I guess I think that the best answer to this for me is like, I find it funny when someone like, Nina Power will say, well, trans people are responsible for perpetuating, stereotypes of what men and women are. And it's like, well, if you're advocating trans exclusionism, like, obviously you're like, it's like, why would people want to fit tidily into one category? If what you're saying is that these two categories are the only categories which are valid, then it totally makes sense that the response to that amongst people who are marginalized is going to be, well, I really better fucking fit into one of these categories, right? So, and I could relate it to a similar example, like in France, they banned the burqa right outside, and then, but this is just keeping women inside, right? And it's actually contributing to, their lack of engagement in the public domain, right? So I guess what I mean is even if one, and I realize those are very different examples, but what I'm trying to say is that even if one, thinks of these manifestations as being expressions of caste rather than class, or as being essentializing in some way, I think one has to look at why these things occur. I mean, my personal view about this would probably be that, in an ideal world, no one would have to physically transition, uh, or would feel the same pressure to, but we're not in an ideal world. And, our society obviously circumscribes, what you can be, how you can feel, how you can behave, right, based on these categories. And therefore, I would never put myself in a position of criticizing anyone, right, because they've made that choice. So again, I think similarly, this is what strikes me as quite naive about Power's position on these issues, is because she's unable to separate out, uh, the ideal world in which these things wouldn't be necessary from the prescriptions that we're actually going to offer to social reality in the present, right?
Violet, how do you respond to both my commentary and Conrad's on these issues?
Um, those are a lot of points to go through. So I'll just, I mean, you already made several points, and Conrad has also made several points. So I'm not sure I can actually go through all these points, but uh, nonetheless, I would say that like the question you made about medicine is pretty interesting. To an extent, like obviously, but you know what the thing about like the power's position, like, and a lot of people, a lot of feminists who are specifically coming from a position of trans skepticism, like talk about transitioning hormones, etc., allowing people to allowing the big pharma to make a lot of profit, etc. But this is just kind of weird to me, because like medicine has always been implicated in power relations. So like even the advent of capitalism to an extent is largely dependent on like medical technologies, and in the 19th century especially, medicine was fundamental in constituting the labor force that capitalism had to use. So why not criticize that as well? Why not go ahead and just criticize medicine for actually producing increasing the lifespan of the proletarian population, and thus allowing capitalism a firmer footing? Why not just go ahead and do that as well? Like why just stick to trans people as the object of criticism? So that's a bit weird to me, and also in the sense that I have to see like a lot of what can be called neoliberalism. In a sense, I see it as like kind of a strategic reorientation on the part of like capitalist states in the face of a lot of like the molecular anti-authoritarian struggles of the 70s, that especially politicize notions of, say, the sex, body, or sexuality, etc. But there was when I say it's a strategic reorientation, what I mean is like to an extent these struggles were not allowed to develop to their like logical anti-capitalist conclusion, but were like recuperated and reabsorbed within the state. um and like moreover, like what is important, I think, is not like I think we should separate the medical establishment from medicine itself. Like we know the Black Panthers, for instance, pointed out the medical racism, and they ran their own clinics. So I think today there is a lot of literature on, not a lot, I would say a fair amount of literature on producing autonomous means of health. And we see these ideas such as like community clinics kind of cropping up again. So for me, the problem is not medicine, which is like should we do away with a lot of medicine that saves people's lives, because like even some of these medicines to an extent are dependent on what you may call exploitation. So it's not the point for me is not like medicine, but the medical establishment which is enmeshed in this like relations of power. So it's but at the same time I would say it's not about simply having the right people within the medical establishment and having the right voices speaking. Is about a complete I would say a complete restructuring of what constitutes like the medical establishment and how medicine is like constituted. So I think in that sense we can perhaps think of a future where like hormones are available, but they are not mediated through a medical establishment, through this whole rhetoric of say through this whole this discretionary medical gaze that determines whether you are adhering to a true trans narrative or not, that decides whether you deserve to have hormones or not. I think hormones would simply be seen as something that instead of like a lot of people think like for instance like transitioning is kind of erasing the material body or like doing away with the body, but I see it instead as like intensifying the corporeality of the body. In that sense like in that sense it's a bit like drugs, in the sense that they let you have more intense experience and perhaps kind of reconceptualize the relation you have with your body itself. So it's kind of an intensification of that, not an erasure of the body. So obviously I don't know what like an anti-capitalist or communist medicine would look like, so I think it's hard to kind of prefigure that. I think it would look totally different, but I would not uh, for that reason create some kind of like moral imperative as to whether somebody should transition or not. After all, like even the drugs you take to get rid of a flu or any kind of surgery you undergo also helps make profit for like capitalism. So like unless you are to hold everyone equally accountable and not just trans people, I don't think that that kind of moral imperative really works.
And this is where I see all three of us are agreeing. You know, I have a quotation from Conrad's article that we're talking about, where Conrad says, moreover, where capitalism sanctions these kind of multivalent expressions, it also must simultaneously repress them so as to ensure the continuance of a binary organization essential to its reproduction. And I think this really it gets to where Nina Power's sense of feminism is very limited, where she sees only capitalism as being able to capitalism as affirming one form and only one form at a time, instead of capitalism simultaneously sanction allowing multiple forms but also repressing multiple forms at the same time, right? And so capitalism is allowing trans people to exist and allowing cis women to exist, but it's repressing them both too, right? So it isn't so simple that only that capitalism is favoring one group or another in some simplistic kind of binary sense. Even in the case of different classes, there are moments when certain groups of a certain substrata of classes get briefly championed or idealized by capitalism before they are then thrown to the wayside for some other ideological imperative. So I think that that's where we're all coming to a shared consensus about this, which is that capitalism, it doesn't have to only validate performativity or only validate biologism. It can repress performativity and repress biologism at the same fucking time.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that's that's the great that for me is the because capitalism is obviously still dependent upon a division of labor, which is connected with the sort of biological reification of sex. At the same time, like I said, I think the entry of women into the workforce en masse has had a tremendously destabilizing effect, simultaneous to the continuance of this dependence upon our notions of that. Right. So I see this as being a time in which I think it's understandable that there's a lot of discourse which is generated around this issue. I think what's clear, I think this issue only can be resolved at the point where you have I would say the abolition of capitalism. I mean, because capitalism is a structure that is just dependent upon unwaged labor, period, right? And that labor is disproportionately offloaded on women. And so I think again, you're going to have these essentialist notions being perpetuated for as long as that happens. I don't think trans identity itself as a kind of phenomenon, is like is a priori revolutionary. But I do think that it's symptomatic of contradictions within the social structure that could engender a larger upheaval, right? Or be part of that.
Right. I think I completely agree with Conrad on that, especially like with trans identity not being a priori revolutionary, but being reflective of the contradictions immanent within the social structure. I think like I'm fully in agreement with that.
And I agree as well in that, I don't think that transness is inherently revolutionary, but I think that transness as something that shakes up one's notion of, as Violet said, in that HRT, like a psychedelic drug can expand your ability to know your body. Arguably, it might make certain people in the trans spectrum more attenuated to economic, social, political realities, such as to radicalize them in some cases. But in other cases, it will make some trans people more fragile about their petty bourgeois status, and thus glom onto more reactionary politics. And you can see that in someone like Caitlyn Jenner, and I'm even skeptical about trans celebrities like Elliot Page necessarily being defenders of the trans working class. In many cases, those people will be people who are benefiting from capitalism, even while being trans, and also oppressed by it. And they will be, the ruling class will be using them for what the ruling class uses everyone for, which is to promote, the agenda of capitalism. And so I'm not someone who thinks that being trans is revolutionary, but I do think that the trans experience can open up a kind of chiasm that makes people who are trans, or people who are around trans people, more open to different revolutionary perspectives in some situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, trans people, I think the likelihood maybe of following that vector is higher, right, than in certain groups, right, because of the relatively marginal position of trans people, right, and an awareness of social injustice that can be engendered as a consequence of that disposition. But I do think it's the case that within every, that there are different lines of flight within every sort of, every kind of position in the social spectrum. Right. So I think that of course, like women, there are different ways in which they can perceive and conceptualize their own identities. Men, different kinds of minorities, and so forth. Right. Again, I think that the trans experience is experimental and marginal enough that and I don't have like stats on this or something. That it may guide people toward that. But it's like I said, like I also think that there can be, and you were just saying this, there can be a strong tendency towards forms of naturalization or reification that emerge within that.
This has been an amazing conversation. This feels like a natural stopping point to me a little bit. But if anyone else has any questions or any things that you think we didn't cover carefully enough in this conversation, I'm open to continuing it somewhat longer. I do have 20 or 30 more minutes if we need to continue. But this feels like a place where we all kind of tied up our threads, and we agree on roughly similar positions on capitalism and the history of gender and Nina Power's reductivism. But any other questions or comments from either Conrad or Violet?
I just want to say quickly, I'll just let me say quickly as a last note, and then maybe, do you mind, Violet, if I go, or do you want to go now?
No, I just had a question for you, so maybe you could hear out the question and then like answer
Sure.
it along. Yeah. So, um, uh, my question would be like, what forms do you see like trans struggles kind of taking if it were to assume an anti-capitalist dimension? Because we already see a lot of kind of a kind of recuperation of trans struggles by NGOs, etc., and a kind of like monopolization over the struggles by these NGOs and other bodies. So, in if like an anti-capitalist trans struggle were to like develop, like what kind of form do you see it taking?
That's such a
Who is
hard.
this question for? Are you asking both of us?
No, it's for Conrad.
Okay.
Uh that's that's a difficult one for me. I mean, I think that in a way, sometimes you see these um, lines of solidarity that are sometimes broached, right? So like, I know that there's a lot of enthusiasm for like Beatrice Precadio or Paul Precadio now, I guess. Like the book Testo Junkie, which has been referenced by Catherine Malibu and the Xenofeminists and so forth. Yeah, I mean, I think that the anti-capitalist aspect, is the aspect again which is more about challenging rather than reifying our gender dispensation. But I think for that to achieve a genuinely anti-capitalist form, I think it has to find a way of achieving solidarity with trans people who don't necessarily, who are maybe more committed to an unironic view of their own identity, right? Because I don't think it can afford to be dismissive of those people or condescending to those people,
Right.
right? So again, I think this is. I mentioned that you have this dimension playing out in different fields, but sometimes you see areas in which it works, right? So I was giving the example of is the Islamo-gauchiste, right? This sort of slur in France. Well, it's like French Muslims voted, en masse for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, right, in the last presidential election, to the point that he was, I think 2% away from making it to the deuxième tour. And without Muslims, the French left is nothing, right? So in spite of there maybe being differences between some Muslims and how they view their identity, in the position of Mélenchon, you see that there's a very productive allyship that's able to be forged. So again, I think that it's about uniting people who have this more kind of experimental, challenging sort of viewpoint with those people that maybe don't to the same degree.
Right.
But for there to actually be a dialogue and for there to be political solidarity and working together, right?
Right. Thank you for answering that. That's a really good answer, I think.
And I wanted to answer that question, even though it wasn't directed to me, because I've been looking into this. This has been a topic of my research in certain ways. And I've been, there's this organization which doesn't like to be talked about so much, but I bring it up because I think that people should know about it. It's called the Radical Fairies, and they were a group of people who were organized starting in the United States in the 1970s, and they kind of have set up kind of queer pagan communes around the United States. They have one in the UK, they have one in France, they have a couple of these communes in other parts of the globe, from my understanding. And when they were founded in the United States, they were kind of this the Radical Fairies was this collaboration between indigenous American communities and kind of gay people who were kind of Marxist or leftist or upset with the system to some degree. And they were founded by Harry Hay, who has a lot of negative and positive things said about him for various reasons. But Harry Hay was, at the time when he was founding the Radical Fairies, he was a former Marxist-Leninist, which I'm not enthusiastic about that, of course, political position of myself. But it's still notable that this group was founded with somewhat Marxist principles influencing them, however distantly. But the Radical Fairies were these people they were influenced by Native Americans who had gender and sex identities whose identities were not limited to the gender sex binary in the United States, and the Radical Fairies were people who were originally constituted mainly by people identifying as gay men, but they ended up being a major force of like a huge number of them identified as non-binary, identified outside of that at an earlier point than the mainstream transgender movement, or what people in trans studies these days might call the trans tipping point, which took place in 2013 when like transness went mainstream enough that the average person had to learn what it fucking was. So I think that there are movements like that which are using these communes, these kind of separate like locations for somewhat autonomy on a resource level, but also somewhat free expression among other queer groups, where these differences can be slowly unwinded before making it all the way into kind of mainstream culture. I think there's enormous potential there. I think there's enormous potential in people who are using that category and mixing it with union demands or with more classically so-called old left aspects of Marxism and anarchism, which are based in commodity production. So um, not that the Radical Fairies is itself automatically a leftist organization or a Marxist organization, but they were one of these groups that still has a certain amount of autonomy from the system, and has this ability to exist outside of it and to shift the discourse from their isolation over a period of time, and also involved in building a kind of counterpower, however diluted by whatever various ideological trends present.
Could I just add to that too? Did you mind?
Sure, by all means.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, I mean, I think Leslie Feenberg, right? Kind of this idea of transgender. I mean, I like the term transgender because on one hand, it amasses together all these very, very diverse distinctions, right? And I would think of really, she had in her essay, transgender liberation, she just cites like this huge array of different historical examples. And to me, this is just sort of like what's excluded by these binaries that emerge within the commodity form historically. But I think what's important about the term transgender is that on one hand, it's capable of unifying, somewhat artificially, but nevertheless, of unifying all these diverse distinctions. But on the other hand, it functions as an independent term, so that it doesn't just become, oh well, it's just man or woman, right? There's something else that we're talking about as well, and that lends a certain clarity to the difference. And I also wanted to say one thing I think is really interesting is like if you follow kind of the materialist theorization that I'm developing,
we've lost really you, Conrad. Hello.
Hello. Yep.
Hello.
No, I can hear Conrad.
Okay, we're good now. We're good.
If you follow kind of the materialist view that I'm pursuing, or any kind of constructivist viewpoint, really, I think one of the interesting things about it is that, in a way, because we like to say that we use these terms like, cis or trans, and they have some sort of descriptive validity. But at the same time, it's like we're all, if gender, sex, if these don't issue from biology, then in a way we're all trans, right? They're just socially reified forms of being trans, right? Because the designation of sex or gender or some kind of categorical distinction, is a condition of for the existence of any person, right, or any society. So I think that's important to remember as well. That kind of I like that idea, but we're all trans in a way, too.
I might put more disclaimers in that kind of phrasing potentially, but I think that there's a base aspect of what you're saying there, Conrad, which is true, is that we all may find a trans atom in our consciousness at any point in our lives, and you do see trans women who have figured out that they were trans women in their 80s or 90s, and they have still engaged in some expression of what atom of difference that they find in their body mind or something, So I mean, I think we're definitely all of us are potentially trans for sure. Now, are all of us dealing with all of the hazards of walking down the street, wearing a dress but having a face that looks like it doesn't match the clothes you're wearing? No, like we're not all having the experience of transness in its material, visceral, painful reality, but we're all potentially the potential of the flesh means all of our bodies could be trans in a certain sense, until we're absolutely 100% certain that we're not, which I don't think cis identity wants you to believe that cis people can be absolutely sure that they're not trans, but I think Conrad, you do suggest a good reason for questioning that cis people could all be trans potentially. So
well, what I mean is like that just that cisgender to like it's already tautological to identify with the thing you're given at it can already be read tautologically, like to identify with what happens to you at birth. It's like, but the point is, if that's not happening at birth, right, then there's already a trans shift, right? And forms of social designation which penetrate and affect everyone. Now, the trans experience itself, I'm not saying everyone has that experience, in terms of that category and how it functions in our society. I don't want to diminish it, right? But I'm just saying, I think that it would be better for us as a society and collectively to get away from the idea, that there are, that the baseline are these biological designations, and then if you don't identify with that, you're trans. I think that's a very limited view, right?
I'm actually in almost in perfect agreement with Conrad over here. So I mean, I agree. So one idea I've been developing is like to understand dysphoria not as something individual but as something social. And if we understand like the sexed body as like this organization of the body in like this hierarchy, the body being hierarchized and organized to be actually incorporated into, say, apparatuses of government or like capitalism, then in a sense, like if that were to, like Conrad said, if that were to not exist, then in a sense we would all be trans, or like I would say, like in a sense, we could envision maybe not a trans identity as it is articulated today, but a sense of transness that is all about like this, a kind of about this kind of like the body organized in an anarchic manner as opposed to a hierarchical manner. So um, yeah.
I I love that phrasing, Violet. And I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Uh, uh, yes. I mean, I think that there's reason to be skeptical, to be careful about broad claims that erase difference, but I think that there does need to be a recognition from people like Nina Power that we are all trans, certainly more than other people, certainly, and I do think there needs to be a collective investment in trans people in that sense. So I don't oppose the phrase, but perhaps I just feel that there's a certain essentialism in that phrasing too. I understand the meaning that is being implied by both of you, though. But this has been a great conversation about transness and Marxism and Anarchism and various intellectuals in the Marxist tradition. They're in conversation right now. Thank you both for this amazing conversation. And I hope we can talk all have a conversation again. This has been a great episode of this is the 11th episode of the Facing Autonomy podcast, and we've had an excellent discussion today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you guys.